I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on the imminent massive prisoner exchange between the West and Russia, with prominent names like Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich expected to be released. And we continue our conversation with researcher and author Nicole Grajewski on the relationship between Russia and Iran.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 1st of August, 2 years and 164 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes, and foreign correspondent, James Kilner. We recorded this episode at 1 p.m. British summertime amid the breaking news of the impending prisoner exchange. Before talking about that prisoner exchange, I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start in Ukraine then, where debris from Russian drones shot down by the Air Force injured 2 people and damaged 2 homes in the region surrounding the capital, Kyiv authorities reported on Thursday. This marked the second such attack on the area in as many nights. The authorities said there were no direct hits to residential or critical infrastructure, and the Air Force announced it had intercepted all 7 Shahed-type drones involved in the attack. The strike came a day after Ukraine reported Russia used 87 drones in one of the largest drone attacks of the war. The 2 people injured in the attacks were identified in Ukrainian media as a former Russian lawmaker turned Kremlin critic and his wife. The former lawmaker, Ilya Ponomaryov, who has lived in Ukraine for years and holds Ukrainian citizenship, wrote on X that Thursday felt like his, quote, second birthday, and that he would elaborate later. Ukrainska Pravda, another Ukrainian media outlet, cited sources saying that drone fragments had damaged his home, injuring him and his wife. Another news site published a picture of him looking into a camera, his face and upper chest spattered with blood. He did not immediately respond to our request for comment. Overnight, Russia also launched Iskander-M ballistic missiles at the heavily battered northeastern region of Kharkiv, injuring 1 person, according to the region's governor. Ukraine's national railway company reported that the missile attack damaged tracks, power supply facilities, 2 locomotives, and both freight and passenger cars. Moving on, a mother and her daughter were killed by Russian shelling that struck the town of Nicole in Ukraine's eastern Dnipropetrovsk region, according again to the region's governor. Quote, "These are the tragic consequences of Russian shelling. They hit the city with a dozen shells," said Serhiy Lysak via Telegram on Thursday. Lysak reported damage to private homes, a fire station, a college, a school and buses, though he did not specify the artillery's exact location. Reuters has not independently verified that report. In the central eastern Dnipropetrovsk region, the governor said that the Air Force had shot down 1 drone, with no casualties reported. In Russia, according to the ISW, that's the Institute for the Study of War, the Washington, D.C.-based think tank, Ukrainian forces struck a weapons and equipment warehouse in Kursk city on the night of July the 30th. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces struck at the warehouse overnight, and acting Kursk Oblast Governor Alexei Smirnov claimed that Ukraine caused the facility to catch fire. The Russian MOD and other Russian sources claimed that Russian air defences destroyed an unspecified number of Ukrainian drones and missiles, including at least 1 Neptune anti-ship missile over the oblast. Staying with the ISW just for a few frontline updates, they write that a Russian insider source claimed on July the 31st that Ukrainian forces ambushed Russian soldiers who were conducting sabotage and reconnaissance operations in the Chernihiv Oblast border area. This insider source claimed that the ambush killed 5 soldiers, and that Russian military leadership concealed this failure following the insurgent ambush of Wagner Group personnel in Mali that we reported about last week. Other frontline updates: Russian forces recently marginally advanced in eastern Chasiv Yar amid continued offensive operations in the area on July the 31st. Russian forces also advanced within Zelizne, southeast of Toretsk, amid continued offensive operations near Toretsk, and there was fighting within the town itself. And finally, Russian forces continued offensive operations near Avdiivka on July the 31st, but there were no confirmed changes to the front line. Next, Russian missile units have conducted drills on one of the disputed Kuril Islands, which Japan claims as its territory. This is according to the Interfax news agency. According to the report, which cited the Russian Defense Ministry, the troops practice maneuvering and camouflaging their vehicles on Matua Island. The Kuril Islands have been a point of contention since Soviet troops seized the four-island chain off Japan's Hokkaido at the end of World War II. The islands have remained in Russia's hands, leading to an ongoing dispute that has prevented Japan and Russia from signing a formal peace treaty. Finally, the Kremlin said on Thursday that Russian forces will be prepared to shoot down Ukraine's first batch of F-16 jets, and the weapons will not be a, quote, panacea for Kyiv's army. Lithuanian and US officials confirmed on Wednesday that Ukraine had received the first order of long-awaited jets, which are equipped with a 20mm cannon and can carry bombs, rockets and missiles. And of course, we'll go to Joe Barnes later to tell us more about the F-16s, as you've been writing up this story for The Telegraph. A couple of diplomatic updates to bring you then. Moldova's foreign ministry said on Thursday it had expelled a Russian diplomat and summoned Russia's ambassador to issue a formal protest a day after its law enforcement agencies detained two officials on treason and conspiracy allegations. A Moldovan security source said the two people had been detained on Tuesday on suspicion of providing information to the Russian embassy's deputy defense attaché in the capital of Chisinau. Moving to the east, Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te warned on Tuesday that a Chinese invasion of the self-governed island would have more severe global repercussions than Vladimir Putin's war on Ukraine or the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Lai made this statement during the largest ever gathering of foreign lawmakers and dignitaries in Taipei at a summit organised by the Interparliamentary Alliance on China. This coalition, comprising hundreds of members from parliaments in over 35 countries, is dedicated to monitoring Beijing's threats to democracy and human rights. And finally, before we go to James Rothwell, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has spoken with a number of French outlets, Le Monde, Libération, L'Équipe and Agence France-Presse. A couple of highlights then from his interview. Firstly, the point about Russia's presence at an upcoming peace summit in November. Zelensky said, quoting now, "I believe, as do most countries, that at the second peace summit in November, Russian representatives must be present, otherwise we won't achieve viable results." He continues, "If the whole world wants them at the negotiating table, then we can't be against it." Zelensky, however, was firm on the point of Ukraine's territorial integrity, but he did say that this, quote, "doesn't mean we have to do it by force of arms alone. Today, we are on the front line as long as Russia wants to wage war, and then we can resolve these issues diplomatically, if Russia wants to," he said. And on conceding territory, Zelensky said this is, quote, "not the best option," end quote. Well, let's leave the military, political and diplomatic updates and go to the biggest story of the day in terms of our live blog, that the West and Russia are gearing up, and maybe it's even happened, for the biggest prisoner swap since the Cold War. James Rothwell, our Berlin correspondent, can I come to you first? What's happening and when did we first learn of this?
Hi, David. Yeah, so the news is just breaking right now that it does appear that Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was jailed in Russia in a sham trial on highly dubious false espionage charges, is going to be released as part of a prison swap that has already happened or is imminent or is happening now. It's not quite clear yet, which will be the biggest prisoner exchange between the US and Russia since the Cold War. Absolutely delightful development at the moment. Obviously, pretty much everyone in the journalism industry has been really nervous about Evan and anxiously awaiting news that he will be freed. And sources have told Bloomberg news agency that that is the case. Sources familiar with the situation and the ongoing hostage talks say that he is going to be released as part of a wider prisoner swap that will also probably include Vadim Krasikov, the so-called Berlin bicycle killer who assassinated a Chechen dissident in Berlin a few years ago and has been in prison in Germany for that offence. Also on the western side, some other foreign citizens wrongly jailed by Russia, dissidents, that sort of thing, also part of the mix. But as I said, this is a story that's literally breaking now, so the details are coming through in dribs and drabs.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much for joining us as well. I realised that we got the Bloomberg report in at about 20-1, which I sent straight over to you. James and Joe, is there much we can say about the timing here? Why has this happened now? I mean, listeners will remember that Gershkovich was formally convicted, I think it was last week, which many commentators observed that could be a precursor to his release. What can we say? I mean, what does this tell us about Russian diplomacy, the West's diplomacy, that this is happening right now?
Yeah, it's difficult to say actually what the answer is in terms of the timing. I've actually just had this discussion on the phone with my editor, which is why I'm slightly delayed in coming to the podcast. The one theory that I suppose could be raised is that we do have a US election coming up, which may lead to a change in administration. Prior to President Joe Biden stepping down from the campaign, it was sort of largely assumed that there was going to be a Trump administration by many people. It's less clear now who's going to win that election. This is purely my speculation, but perhaps there was some uncertainty in Moscow as to who they were likely to be dealing with. Maybe they decided that they should rush through the conclusion of this prisoner swap, which doesn't just involve Evan, it involves lots of other people. So it's difficult to correlate the timings to recent events for that reason, and that's why it's just a theory. But they may have decided to expedite it and get it out of the way in the run-up to the US election and the change of administration. Just a theory, just speculation, and we may know in time what the sort of underlying motivation for the timing of this is.
Thank you so much, James. Joe and James Kilner, can I come to you? What names jump out to you on the Western side of the balance sheet? And also James Kilner on the Russian side as well. What more can we say about some of these names that have been bandied around?
Yeah, so some of the names that we were mentioning yesterday included in our piece, and then it's starting. So I was hearing sort of last night that Evan, our colleague from the Wall Street Journal, was going to be included, but there was other notable people that have also been held in Russian custody. One is Paul Whelan, a former US Marine. He has a British, Canadian and American passport as well through his various sort of birth connections. He appears to be on that list. The other one I would look at is Vladimir Kara-Murza, a Russian-British opposition activist in Russia, been arrested. Probably wouldn't have lasted that much longer in Russian custody. If you look at what happened to Alexei Navalny, sort of a big risk when it comes to opposition figures. But interestingly, because of Vladimir Kara-Murza's UK ties, he has been one of the people who have been on the eyes of British politicians and British officials. So writing in earlier, Tony Diver, US editor, was saying Kara-Murza is being the name on the lips of several MPs, speaking to the Foreign Office to basically push them to negotiate, speak with the US, Germany, Russia, whoever else is involved in this big diplomatic effort. Because I'm sure it's just not a case of two countries. It's going to require a lot of heavy lifting. So it's interesting that the Brits were pushing for that, and because Britain doesn't traditionally participate in prisoner swaps. So basically we believe that Britain has been lobbying the US to make sure Vladimir Kara-Murza is included. And this is what one MP told Tony. The US has had Kara-Murza on their radar, but there are no guarantees. The Russians are renowned for driving a very hard bargain. But then just more in a wider point, and this is just me sort of thinking out loud, is the more and more it's sort of great. You've got imprisoned people who are wrongly imprisoned, like Evan, Paul Whelan, no doubt, on that list as well. But then you have Russian opposition figures that are coming back. If the West is going to sort of help to overcome Putin's regime, they're going to need opposition figures to do that. And there aren't actually that many opposition figures because they're most likely locked up in Russia. James Kilner will probably have more sort of info on that. But I think that's interesting that the sort of the dual nationals opposition figures are being prioritised and looked at, as well as overseas citizens who have been locked up. So yeah, interesting stuff.
Thank you very much, James Rothwell and Joe Barnes. Well, James Kilner, can I come to you next? What can we say and analyse on who potentially might be included on the Russian side of this deal? And what have you seen of the reaction within Russia, and what does it mean for Russia?
Hi, David. So this is definitely wrong-footed Russia correspondents to a large extent, and Russia analysts. I've been ringing around talking to people this morning asking what they make of it, and the timing has really baffled people. As James in Berlin was saying, coming only a few months before the US presidential election, around which there's been lots of speculation about the Kremlin backing Trump, etc. Why would he seemingly give this great win to Biden and Kamala Harris, who's going to be able to pose with these returning prisoners, etc.? It's surely going to undermine Trump. Why not wait for another few months until January or February and then do the deal and then give Trump the win? That has completely sort of thrown our analysis. You know, we can extrapolate, we can theorize, etc. Maybe the reasons behind this go deeper, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, because the entire deal to me, seems a bit one-sided straight off the bat. Obviously, the Kremlin is very keen to get Krasikov back. As James again said, he's this FSB assassin who was arrested in 2019 for the murder on a bicycle of this Chechen turncoat in central Berlin. He also was wanted in Moscow for another murder. Putin's always very keen to get his FSB guys back, and this guy was obviously a cold-hearted killer. He was a reliable assassin, and Putin wanted him back. But the other guys on the Russian list, they are relatively small fry. They were like crypto traders, they were IT cyber experts, businessmen doing deals to get US military-grade kit into Russia after the sanctions. They were money laundering. That is that sort of thing. So you got Krasikov, and then a huge gap, and then you got a list of maybe only 4 to 6 other Russian IT guys and businessmen who are coming back supposedly under this deal. On the Western side, you might have a list as long as 15 people that Joe was also talking about, headed by Gershkovich. Now, Gershkovich was this huge asset Putin had captured for himself, and he's giving it over. So, I mean, that's a huge thing too. He's also giving Whelan over, who's had in prison for a few years. He's this British-American former Marine who's also been done for spying, and the list continues. There's also another journalist, Alsu Kumasheva, sentenced on the same day as Gershkovich in July. She was arrested going to see her mum on holiday, working for Radio Free Europe, and she was in prison for 6.5 years on the same day as Gershkovich last month. She might be on the list, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of high-profile people. Joe was talking about Karamurza, associates of Navalny, etc., etc. List could be as big as 15. On the Western side, this could be the biggest prisoner swap of Russia since 1985. Why has it happened now? What is Putin doing? Is this weakness? Does he feel that he has no choice but to make this deal now? It poses far more questions than it answers, David.
Well, thank you very much, James Kilner, for that. James Rothwell, can I come back to you? And I think maybe on this point we can then bring in Joe and James Kilner afterwards. But we were talking when we were recording for the Battle Lines podcast earlier today, which to all of our listeners is our sister podcast looking at defence and foreign affairs at The Telegraph. That will go out tomorrow morning. We were talking about the Israel strikes, the Israel assassinations. But then we had a short discussion after that about this impending prisoner swap, in which you talked about the hostage diplomacy, how hostage diplomacy is back. Do you want to just expand on that to our listeners? And because obviously this is a very good day in some respects, people are coming home, but you sounded a note of warning for the years ahead.
Well, yes, what I meant is that we seem to be living in an age of hostage diplomacy now, and I don't necessarily mean vis-a-vis Russia and the West. I also mean in terms of Iran, which in recent years has really made a habit of locking up foreigners on dubious spying charges and then essentially holding them hostage until certain demands can be met. We all remember the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, which is a pretty striking illustration of that, and thankfully she's now been freed. It's a sign that authoritarian regimes and enemies of the West feel that they can get the leverage that they so badly desire by picking out an unfortunate holder of foreign citizenship inside their country, maybe someone who's visiting family, maybe someone who's working in journalism like Evan, maybe they're doing something else in that country, and they could lock them up, put them on trial on a bunch of trumped up charges, and then use them as a pawn or a chess piece in negotiations with the West to extract concessions. And this wasn't always the way that the West operated. A couple of decades ago, previous US administrations made a big deal of the fact that they didn't negotiate when it came to hostages. They certainly wouldn't pay ransoms. I'm not suggesting that any ransoms have been paid in this most recent case, but that does seem to be shifting. I'm not sure whether that means that Western leverage has decreased or whether the other side's leverage has increased. But it feels like a new development. It feels like hostage diplomacy is increasingly becoming a big tool in the arsenal of some of these hostile regimes, and that may bode ill for the status of foreigners in any country like Iran or Russia. It does seem that the risk of being arrested, locked up and convicted of some fantastical offence or another is now a very real risk if you're a foreigner in country.
Well, thank you very much, James Rothwell, our Berlin correspondent. Joe Barnes and James Kilner, before we move on from this story, any final thoughts or comments from you that we've maybe not mentioned just yet?
something you said earlier, Joe, about Kara-Murza. I don't think we can overread into these opposition figures being sort of a potential sparking revolution or inciting anything against Putin from overseas. Navalny was very much a lone figurehead in that regard. Vladimir Kara-Murza and others, they're well known in the West, but they just wouldn't have the same cachet in Russia. Certainly no appetite for revolution. So I don't think the Kremlin sees a risk in that. That's what I wanted to say.
No, that's interesting, and definitely a reason why Putin might have considered them in large numbers not to be too much for a price to pay to get back just one sort of former SFB agent. Yeah, but the other thing is, and I'm sure I remember speaking to people after the last prisoner exchange, which included American basketball player who was arrested and jailed in Russia for possessing, I think, some sort of cannabis oil or something like that. And she was swapped for Victor Bout, the sort of a notorious arms dealer who was jailed by America after being sort of captured by the CIA. Russia would have felt that it got a really probably great deal out of that one. So I think actually the West will be a lot more pleased that they have actually got a lot of high-profile people out of Russia if this deal does play out as expected. But it does sort of spark the idea that hostage diplomacy is back. And it does run the risk of, if you are a dual national, just a passport holder travelling to the likes of Russia, Iran, maybe Venezuela in the future, etc., it's only going to be more risky because you'll be seen as sort of easy collateral in.
Well, thank you very much, James Rothwell, Joe Barnes and James Kilner. Joe Barnes, would you talk to us a little bit about the F-16s arriving in Ukraine? That's been confirmed. You've written this up for The Telegraph. We'll talk about that and then move to our final thoughts. Joe Barnes.
Yeah, so yesterday, Bloomberg first reported that F-16s had arrived in Ukraine and been delivered an unspecified number. We believe that now to be 6 from the Dutch government. But then I want to look into, if they had arrived in Ukraine, had they actually been flown yet? Because why would you deliver something to Ukraine that it isn't ready or isn't going to use straight away? Because it's just there's no point of the risk reward isn't there. So I got speaking to people, and it turns out that these F-16s have been flying, and we believe there's no actual confirmation yet. The Ukrainians are being very secretive about it. We believe that the F-16s that have flown in Ukraine so far have been flown basically on very specific air defense missions. We don't know what missions they are, what they actually did, what they took down, if they took down anything, but apparently they have flown already. I put this to the Ukrainian Air Force, and they did not deny it. But what have we seen? So first of all, we've seen a couple of images. We've seen a pixelated picture, which was circulated first on social media and picked up by Ukrainian media outlets, of an F-16, which is apparently in the skies above Ukraine. It looks a bit suspicious. It's unmarked. It isn't carrying any weapons. But then there is another video of a F-16 shot from the ground, flying through the sky. You couldn't tell where it is, but apparently it is in Ukraine. And that is actually equipped with what looks like weapons. So we've come to learn, as I mentioned, there's about 6 F-16s have been delivered from the Dutch. We've still got the Danish ones to come, and then some Belgian and Norwegian will also follow that. So sort of in the next few years, 79 F-16s will be delivered, maybe more. We don't know if they're all going to be flying. James reported over the weekend that still there aren't enough pilots to fly these aircraft. Our lot's going to be cannibalized for spare parts. We don't know the answers to that yet, but it's interesting. And look, the arrivals of these F-16s are going to be met with significant fanfare, especially when they start getting used en masse and more often, and we actually see sort of more once they're confirmed, essentially, because we've had the commander of Ukraine's Navy saying, look, they're going to help challenge Russia's full dominance over the Black Seas. But I would add caution that Western aviation experts, you speak to like Justin Bronk, Rusi and others, they all say the same, that F-16s aren't going to be a war-winning silver bullet for the Ukrainians. They will be part of a wider sort of system that will help, because they are a sort of a much more modern aircraft than the Soviet-era jets that they've been flying so far. But on the front line, near the front lines, they're unlikely to be flown for the foreseeable future just because of the depth of Russian surface-to-air missile capabilities, air defense systems, and you're not going to want to throw your new prized asset into a place where it is at risk, a significant risk of being shot down and destroyed. So sort of good news on that front. We don't know a lot about it, but apparently they have been flying. an air defense mission sort of far away from front lines, but far enough in Ukraine for them to be safe and being useful to some degree.
Thank you so much, James, Joe and James. Before we hear their final thoughts, let's return to our interview with author and researcher Nicole Grajewski on the relationship between Russia and Iran. Just like yesterday, you can find a link to Nicole's book in the show notes. Let's pick up where we left off. How stable is their current relationship? I know we don't want to call it an alliance, so will relationship do? Is that the best word?
Yeah, I would say alignment or partnership. I wouldn't say it's the most stable relationship. It's not, Russia and Iran are not like tied together through a kind of binding treaty. But there is some stability as long as the kind of survival of both regimes persists. And that's where I think the real like relationship is. It's really about how both see each other as kind of fundamental to their survival, and that's for different areas. And so Iran really covets Russia's ability to provide it with repression technology, with ability to control the internet, also riot protection and riot gear and best practices between the two countries. Whereas Iran is providing Russia with, artillery shells, with munitions, as well as drones in this war in Ukraine, and also with actual tangible support and sanctions evasion. So it's a lot more symbiotic and dependent. It's one now, I think, of mutual reliance. And that's, I think, the crucial part of it. Whereas as long as they both remain isolated, as long as they both remain in their own types of wars or in their own types of struggles with, these actors, they're probably going to continue cooperating.
In terms of our understandings then of this relationship, what kind of myths or misunderstandings do you encounter about the nature of their relationship, about the nature of the regimes and the countries that you would want to make sure our listeners sort of don't fall into that trap? What would you say?
I think the biggest one that's really becoming in vogue in the United States, at least, is this notion that North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, all are operating together as this big kind of axis. And that's, I think, is just fundamentally not true. There's no coordinated cooperation between them. They may have like similar views and similar, I guess, threat perceptions, but they're not coordinating, and there isn't this kind of emergence of this axis together. And there's a lot of mistrust in it. And I think that's really true in the Russia-Iran relationship. That being said, I do think there is a tendency, and maybe this was more before the war in Ukraine, to underplay the Russia-Iran relationship. I think there wasn't enough of an appreciation for the experience in Syria with all its tensions, but the experience of working between the Russian military, the Russian Ministry of Defense, and also the Iranian IRGC, and also Artesh, which is their more traditional military wing. And so that really provided crucial ties. And also that experience, I think, is one of the more important things in this relationship right now.
When you were researching your new book on this relationship, what was I guess I really like this question, but what surprised you about your research? What did you learn that you maybe didn't expect to?
Well, I wrote a PhD dissertation on a similar topic. So when the book was it was written for a much more broader audience than my PhD, which studied like Russian and Iranian debates about international order. So it was very theoretical and kind of academic. But with this, what I found surprising was that some of the same, I guess, forces that you saw working in Syria were actually the ones that facilitated the shipment of drones to Ukraine. And like that was more than a coincidence, I think.
When you say forces, what do you mean exactly? Sorry.
So there's parts of the IRGC that facilitated the movement of Iranian equipment to Syria. They worked with the Russians on certain surveillance operations through drones in Syria. But those were the IRGC Aerospace Force, the force that actually launched missiles on Israel recently. That was the one that really was crucial to the shipment of drones to Russia. And that's where you see a lot of this connection. And I found that quite important. And I think that's a really significant part of this relationship. One thing in the book that I'm now kind of quite interested in and kind of want to explore more is the use of Russian technology and support in the space sector for Iran. And that was something that I didn't really think about much. But I think that through the book, it became pretty clear that Iran has been really relying on Russia for its ability to kind of become a space power. I think the Russians agreed to send an Iranian astronaut to space. And then also on top of that, I think the Russians are the kind of the mirroring between the Russians and the Iranians in sanctions evasion, and how Russia has really learned from Iran's tactics and are now adopting it.
You described their relationship like a symbiotic relationship. If things continue as they are, a sort of life or death war for Russia and Ukraine, Iran under many international sanctions. Do you think that something like that could develop? I mean, how far away from that do you think we are?
I'm a little bit more skeptical on that. And right now, actually, there's this agreement that was, I believe, signed in 2001 between Russia and Iran. And it's on their mutual bilateral relations. It's not very intensive. It's very kind of shallow. And for like the past 5 years, the Russians and the Iranians have said that they're going to upgrade this treaty to the new level of strategic partnership. They're going to renegotiate it and have this kind of really robust treaty that kind of locks them in together. There's been so many issues on the negotiating in that front. And actually, after the election of Pezeshkian, the new Iranian president, the Iranians said that we're not going to negotiate until he assumes power. And so that, I mean, there's a lot of like procedural issues involved. And I think the Russians were demanding too much from the Iranians, but the Iranians now feel like they're in a more powerful position, so have been pushing back. So I don't think it's going to be that kind of strategic partnership. I think it's going to take a little bit longer to get there.
Are there any more details of those disagreements you could bring us in on?
Well, the problem with both Russia and Iran is that there's so many rumors that come out, and kind of, in some ways, it's almost catty in the way that the Russians and the Iranians complain about each other to the press. So Zamir Kabulov, who is head of the Second Asia Department in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, came out with a statement ahead of the Iranian election saying, "Oh, the negotiations on this have been they're ceased. They're not continuing." And then the Iranians responded like, "No, they're continuing." And then he backtracked. I think Lavrov said something. And so it was this kind of, from my understanding of it, the Russians wanted to pressure the Iranians to accepting certain terms. And that could have involved maybe something with Russia having a grain terminal in southern Iran, Russia maybe having more overflight rights within Iran, and then even potentially, which I don't believe, but there's been rumors of this in the Iranian press, that the Russians have wanted to have some sort of military installation in Iran. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's very unlikely. The use of Iran's territory by any kind of foreign power has been very much taboo. And we saw that in the Syrian civil war when Russia actually, its jets like launched from Iranian territory. And they eventually got kicked out because there was such a strong visceral reaction to it. So I think some of the rumors coming out of it, I would take them with a grain of salt, but it's interesting to watch this dynamic and see them kind of make jabs at each other in their press.
What's the Iranian population sort of, if we can say, the sort of the average Iranian's view on the relationship and view of Russia?
I think the gulf between the Iranian popular view of Russia, the popular sentiment towards Russia, and the current regime is quite large. The Iranians have historically viewed Russia as this foe that's invaded territories. They still invoke Russian annexation of certain territories from Iran that go back to like the 1800s and the 1700s. So there's still this like legacy of mistrust, or at least in the popular discourse in Iran. I think that's one side of it, but there was the reaction by the Iranian population after the war in Ukraine. There were protests in front of, I believe, the Ukrainian embassy saying "Death to Putin." And this isn't the first time. I mean, in 2009 with the Green Movement, Iran's probably their biggest protest movement since Islamic Revolution. There was chants of death to Russia because Russia was providing the Islamic regime with riot equipment. So Russia has had a pretty negative reputation within Iran. And that's a complete contrast to the way I think parts of the military and establishment view Russia.
That's fascinating. You touched on it there in your last answer, but we started this interview talking about the Syrian civil war and the kind of opening of the modern phase of interaction, dependence, relationship between Russia and Iran. But as you mentioned just then, there are lots of historical grievances and historical issues. Could you sketch out some of them for us? So you mentioned then sort of the 18th century Russian expansion. What else? What should we know about?
So historically, Russia and Iran have had a pretty fraught relationship. In the 18th century, there was the Russo-Persian Wars. You see Iran ceding its territory, current-day Armenia, parts of Azerbaijan, to the Russians under the Treaty of Turkmenchai. And this is still actually brought up a lot of the times in Iranian discussions about Russia. And then even during World War II, the Soviets supported a separatist movement in northern Iran, and forces remained in Iran, and this actually was one of the first things that got sent to the United Nations Security Council. During the Iran-Iraq War, the Soviets provided the Iraqis with weapons. The Iranians were very negative about the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan. And then even modern day, I mean, the Russians canceled contracts with Iran due to pressure. Ahmadinejad in I think 2010 called Russia Satan because they were bowing into the United States. So it's continued throughout the relationship, but the historical motifs I think stay pretty present in the Iranian ethos, I guess.
How do you see the next few months and few years panning out for both countries and their relationship?
Well, right now, I mean, Iran is going through some modest changes. They have a new president who will be inaugurated at the end of the summer. And there seems to be some indication that Iran wants to, after the U.S. election, open discussions again on the Iran nuclear program and potentially have some kind of outreach to the West. That's one element of it. And I think that would probably be difficult to navigate with also this Russia relationship. And we haven't seen Iranian ballistic missiles yet in Ukraine. And I think that's partly because there's this hedging where it's quite clear that if Iran does supply Russia with ballistic missiles in Ukraine, that would be a kind of a deal breaker for any kind of discussion on its nuclear program or even with the Europeans and also with the United States. But with Russia, I think that this reliance on Iran is going to likely continue, especially even as it's building its own drones indigenously. I mean, they still need Iran for spare parts, and also Iranians are there helping them with kind of the supply lines and the workforce. So there's that kind of, I guess, embeddedness in it. I do think that there's likely to be much more coordination on the sanctions evasion realm and actually in areas that we haven't really been thinking about. So using Iran as a re-export zone for certain Russian products, agricultural products to the Middle East, but also developing this so-called North-South transit corridor. You may see much more Russian and Iranian cooperation in Iran's military program. I think after the strikes in Israel, it was quite clear Iran needs to improve its accuracy of its missiles. And I think you would probably see Russia offering to help, or at least Iran courting Russia for help. So there's ways that I think Russia can non-tangibly transfer knowledge to Iran. That's probably going to be another area where we see this developing.
Just very quickly on that, you said the North-South Transit Corridor. What is that?
Oh, well, the North-South Transit Corridor it's a pretty grandiose vision by the Russians and the Iranians that dates back to 2002. And it's a multimodal network of rail, sea, and land transport that goes through Iran, up through Russia, and then through St. Petersburg. So kind of through the Caucasus, up Iran, through Azerbaijan, and then it goes onward to Russia. And then also from the Iran southern ports to India and then to other global markets. And so Iran's kind of the crucial node in this because they're the connection between Russia and the Persian Gulf and also South Asian markets. The North-South Transit Corridor has had such a difficult time really taking steam. And right now, there's a lot more of an effort to revive previous plans and work quickly because Russia sees this as an opportunity to open up trade to other markets. And Iran obviously needs this kind of capital and investment in certain rail and infrastructure programs. But there's issues now because of Azerbaijan and the war with Armenia and some of the geographies that were crucial to the North-South Transit Corridor have now been kind of complicated by the Zanzibar corridor from Azerbaijan, which is a competing one. So there's tensions there, but there has been more investment, at least in the Iranian side of this corridor.
Nicole, is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important to mention for our listeners?
I think that one thing that is really important to understanding the Russia-Iran relationship is that it's more reactive. It's built by this mutual opposition to certain policies rather than a productive and kind of, I guess, innovative partnership that's built on broader visions for productive kind of cooperation. It's one that's really bound by defiance and not one that's really blossomed due to conscious efforts. It's a reactive relationship that is bound by a common enemy rather than a common cause in that sense. And I think that's what really is kind of driving this relationship more so than plans for, positive economic development.
And just finally, when doing the research for your PhD and for your book, what did you learn about the people involved? We haven't spoken so much maybe about the personalities of the people on both sides who in the end are sort of driving this, right? They're the ones in the rooms making the deals, signing the orders. What did you learn about them and who should we be aware of?
Within Iran, a lot of its policy towards Russia is through the Supreme National Security Council. And that's kind of the equivalent of the United States National Security Council, but it's beholden to the Supreme Leader. Also in the office of the Supreme Leader, which is his personal office. In addition, the general staff of the Iranian military or the armed forces is a really big part of this in the decision making towards Russia, plus the IRGC. Right now, and the person who's probably the most important for the drone delivery for Russia and Iran is Amir Ali Hajizadeh, who's the head of the IRGC Aerospace Force. And he has quite a bit of connections with parts of the Russian Ministry of Defense, of Department of like Military Technical Cooperation. And that's where you see most of these deals being made. More broadly within Russia, I mean, I think the Russian Security Council and kind of the representation of these kind of hardline conservative views is really representative of those that have pushed this relationship. I mean, Nikolai Patrushev was one of the big parts of this. And whatever his role is right now in the Russian government, and kind of, I know he's been kind of relegated, but he, even since the 90s, has been pushing for this Russia-Iran relationship, which is quite interesting. And you see him flying out to Iran whenever there's a protest and supplying them with riot gear or whatever. I mean, Patrushev's been pretty big in this. And I think, Putin himself, I do think that there is a push and a realization that Iran is kind of in the similar situation. So that's, I guess, the kind of dynamics of who's who in this relationship.
Nicole Grajewski, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Coming up, we hear Joe, James, and James's final thoughts. Let's go now then to our final thoughts. James Rothwell, would you like to go first?
I would like to give a more sophisticated final thought than this, but I think the problem is that it's still quite unclear what's actually happening with this release. I don't want to prematurely celebrate it. I don't want to jinx it. I'm slightly wary of that, but I will say that if Evan is to be released imminently, and that's what the reports are suggesting, that's just absolutely magnificent news. Our listeners will have followed this case very closely over many months. He conducted himself with the utmost dignity and honour, I think, while he was trapped in that horrible glass box in the courthouse in Moscow. And if it is indeed the case that he's being released, and I must stress this is something that's just been reported out as a breaking news story, and all the usual caveats apply, but if it is the case he's being released, that's just absolutely magnificent news. And there hasn't been much of that around recently. So, but at least we've got this news.
Thank you so much, James Rothwell. Joe Barnes, would you like to go next?
Just echo what James has said there. Wait for the official confirmations, wait for images to appear. But yeah, hopefully some really good news. And I know Evan's friends and family will be long awaiting his return, as well as other people. So it's not just him. So yeah, wider good news. The other thing I sort of wanted to mention from this interview that Zelensky gave, he was sort of speaking about what has become Russia's main target. He was saying that Pokrovsk, that town that we speak about a lot, the garrison town that kind of anchors Ukraine's defense of Donetsk mainly, but also the wider Donbass and eastern area of Ukraine. He said that is the main target, and Russia is throwing everything at it. I could see once this sort of international diplomacy and the hostage prisoner swap is sort of getting out of the way, I can see sort of a renewed effort from the Ukrainians that will see them push for more military support because they need it. And they seem to be sort of not struggling, the wrong word, but they're on the back foot in an area that's going to be very important in the context of the wider war, the wider fight against the invasion. So yeah, soon after this is all wrapped up, we'll be focusing on that.
Thank you very much, James Rothwell and Joe Barnes. James Kilner, would you like to share your very final thoughts for today?
A couple of other key stories at the moment, David, going on around outside your visibility, possibly outside your visibility at the moment, because we're so focused on this prisoner exchange. Today is the day that this foreign agents law in Georgia comes into play. Your listeners will remember that there's been long-running protests in Georgia about this Kremlin-inspired law, which imposes extra burdens on Western-backed NGOs, etc. This is the wider fallout of the Ukraine war spreading to the South Caucasus. That is being imposed today. There was a similar law imposed in Kyrgyzstan a few months earlier, and the result of that was some major Western-backed institutions have closed up shops, such as the Open Foundation, George Soros's Open Foundations have closed after 30 years in Bishkek. We're expecting the same fallout in Tbilisi, almost definitely more very high-intensity protests outside the parliament there. That is happening today. And also in Armenia, the Russian border guards who have been guarding the main airport there in Yerevan have withdrawn That happened yesterday. That was under a deal negotiated a few months earlier. That is part of the weakening Armenia-Russia bilateral relations, which is again part of the fallout of the wider fallout of the Ukraine-Russia war and the sort of hardening of West versus Russia sentiment in the South Caucasus. So, two other little tidbits for your listeners, David.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear.